Thank you all for joining me. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Actually, one reason I'm here that Michael and I started the conversation a week ago in Washington, D.C., and it was such a wonderful conversation, I decided to come to Israel to complete the discussion. I also, this was extremely extensive and rich introduction, but I do have to add one detail, because I dropped out of high school, and after I just served in Palmach, the Hebrew University said,
"Not good enough.
Who are you?" and so I had to find a way to get my bagrut, and so I went to study with Martin Buber, and he told me you should dialogue, you should never lecture. So in the 55 years that passed, I haven't given a lecture yet, so I'm just going to say a few things to provoke discussion, and I'm counting on you not to embarrass me. That would be the first time I have not succeeded in getting a dialogue. I'm going to start in a minute, but I have to do two more introduction. First of all the way over here is Dr. Ruth Fleischhauer, former Israel leading psychiatrist, and her other distinction is my bat-daughter. So, second and last but not least, exactly 25 years ago, I was paying for my sins teaching the Harvard Business School, and I was called to emergency to phone that a baby was coming. And I jumped on an airplane and went to New York, and my first grandchild was born. Daniel, Mazal Tov, 25 years. Now, I'm a sociologist, so it requires extra patience on your side when I'm going to talk about legal issues. And in all seriousness now, I have no legal preparation, and though I'm absolutely sure that in the next life I'll come back as a professor of constitutional law, because they have all the good stories, so I just love this stuff, and I see in it all kind of hidden sociological issues. And I also approach it more from a kind of social philosophical viewpoint, and I'm very interested in the difference between Americans, which I think about in the American context, and the way you and others think about these issues. So my vantage point is this communitarian philosophy, which is really an odd philosophical camp, because it's an extremely small camp. I mean, the number of people who write communitarian philosophy, probably will not fill that room. And on the other hand, communitarian thinking is extremely abundant. So you already mentioned the idea behind the kibbutz. You find it in the Bible. You find it in some Catholic thought, in Fabian socialism. So the idea that we are not individuals, but we are members of each other, is a very profound thought, much more widely shared than by I don't know how many orders of magnitude than the labels. So there are a lot of very good people who have never heard the word communitarian who are wonderful communitarian. So the essence of this is where Aristotle said that we are social animals, is really the driving force. Now, usually it's contrasted with liberalism, and the idea of, which serves as the point of contrast is the liberal notion that everybody should define their own sense of the good, and that there should not be an overarching definition of the good. Now, people then can come together and negotiate arrangements and policies, but what's morally right should be up to each individual. And in contrast, communitarian, and then that, by the way, for that reason, the state should be completely neutral. In contrast, the communitarian position is that there must be some shared definition of the good, some critical shared definition of the good, and indeed the state cannot be neutral. And actually one of the most interesting examples given is, which is very hotly debated in the United States, is the definition of marriage. Because The communitarian will argue that whatever position you take on marriage, whether you accept or don't accept gay marriage, whether you, however you define it, including if you say that the state will not intervene and let everybody make the decision, you're taking a moral position, even if you're completely neutral, and therefore it's an example how you cannot escape, not only as a society, as a community, but as a state, some shared definition for the good. Now that's kind of textbook communitarian 101. Where I joined the conversation, it was in the following manner. The term communitarian has been adopted by the East Asians, by the Singaporeans, and by some Chinese scholars, who argued basically that the individual should be treated like a cell in an organ. That the significance of the individual comes from his contribution to society. That it doesn't have a freestanding and therefore not entitled to rights. He's measured by the contribution he does to the common good. And the position some of us took in contrast, and that gets us now to our discussion. All this is kind of a bit of introduction, and I'll use the term liberal communitarianism, that the conversation ought to start with the recognition there is an inevitable tension between our rights, which are as fundamental and even sacred as anything can be, and our commitment to the common good. That each of us, and all of us together, face two fundamental normative claims. None of them is reducible, none of them is privileged. There's on the one hand our right to privacy, free speech, and all the famous list. On the other hand, our concern from the common good, for public safety, for public health, and other things. The conversation starts with that assumption. I mean, all dialogues have to start somewhere. And that's our starting point. And therefore, the real issue is not who is right. The people who talk about the common good and are concerned that we're not doing enough for the common good, and people are concerned that we're violating rights. The conversation is, where are we in history? And different societies are in different places. For instance, if I would be in Japan today, I would argue for more women's rights, for more rights for handicaps, for more minority rights, because from this liberal communitarian viewpoint, Japan tilts way back toward the collective common good. And when we started this movement in the United States, we argued that in the United States after Reagan and Britain after Thatcher, we're falling off historically on the other side of this, that individualism went amok, and there was too much neglect of our responsibility to each other. So the balance is required of all societies, but society, depending on the historical condition, tilt in one direction or the other, and often, as some of us say, they go through history like a drunken soldier, and kind of veering too far in one direction, then correcting, then overcorrecting, and keep trying to find the right point of balance. A good illustration of this argument is what happened in the United States in 2001 after the attack on the American homeland. I just digress for one sentence to say that anybody who was not in the United States at that time cannot begin to understand how profound an impact that had. I mean, some of my liberal colleagues say, well, 3,000 people were killed, you know. There are more killed in traffic every year. What are you talking about? From a sociologist viewpoint, or from an empirical viewpoint, the last time the United States homeland was attacked was in 1812, in any seriousness, and the note that somebody could reach into the capital and hit, it left a psychic mark which lasted till last week, and I'll explain a moment why I said that, and it led to this Patriot Act and many other laws which pulled very strict, heavily, in a big rush, by the way, away from rights toward one common good, security. In effect, the day after 9/11, 70% of Americans said and translating in shorthand, forget about the Constitution. Give me safety. Now that there was no attack for X years, the society is tilting the other direction. And today, the center of the debate is, all this went too far, NSA, all this, and every day, no new hearings, no laws are passed to push it direct in the other direction. So that's a kind of illustration of what I mean, that endless tension, as liberal communitarians see it, between individual rights and the common good, and the attempt to adapt the balance in line with history. And the conversation is all the time, where is the right balance? Are we going too far in one direction or another? Now, as you see by now, I'm up there, not at 30,000 feet, but at 50,000 feet. So many of my colleagues do wonderful, important work on much more precise issues. But that's my job. I'm there, and I appreciate your patience for spending another 40 minutes, up there the stratosphere. So now, most recently, I came across the following observation. And again, I'm talking, the only context which I know anything at all about the law is the American context. Many of the relevant court cases, which I see them again as dialoguing this issue between rights and the common good, and they're concerned when they dealt with privacy as a right, this is the point of collection. And the question, case after case, was it legal or in that sense proper to allow the police to use the following tool or the following methods in order to collect information, or was it an unreasonable violation of privacy, and it should not be allowed? And it hit me that since the development of the cyber age, that very often the issue is not the point of collection, but what happens with the information after it's been collected, the secondary use. And let me illustrate this point, because it's crucial to everything that follows. Imagine two extreme situations. One is we have a toll booth, which we have on our highways, in which you don't have to stop to pay. You have a little chip on your...
Easy Pass. The Easy Pass.
Yeah. Easy Pass, right? And so the computer verifies that indeed you paid and immediately erases that information. So that's one extreme, okay? The opposite extreme, the computer keeps this information, feeds it into a major data bank where all the information about all the other places you stopped, all the information about you, about all CCTVs in the city, and all the speed cameras and all the radio, and it's available, analyzed, this other data, and is available to all comers. The collection is the same, the point of collection. But the violation of privacy is just, couldn't be further apart. I'm not making up that story. Microsoft built a system for New York City. It does exactly what I described to you. It takes the information from all the CCTVs, and again, they're different, but most CCTVs still, you go into the bank, if you left the bank and you didn't rob it, it erases the information 15 minutes or 24 hours later. That's the end of it. So at the most, somebody at that bank could find out that you were at the bank at that day. With Microsoft putting all this into one database, I can get an almost complete profile of your public life. When we were at the bar, where did you spend the night? It's all this in one place and available to police, maybe to the media, maybe to divorce lawyers. So I decided that we need a doctrine that deals with the second use, and the question is, what should be the doctrine? Now, and I started looking around and discovered that there are basically two doctrines which do deal with secondary use. So most court cases don't. Let me just mention for instance, again, please, are people familiar with Jones and all that stuff?
Some might, but some
okay.
not sure.
Well, for instance, just to give you, just to kind of nail down the point a little, we had a court case recently called Jones. In Jones, the police went and attached a GPS to a car of a suspected drug dealer, and the question was that a violation of privacy or not? Means the issue was a collection of the information. Jones is now very often discussed because for the first time the court said it was attached for 28 days. That was too long. And my colleague Oren Kerr mocked it and said, would 27 days been okay, but 28? But the point is, that for the first time it raised the question, not simply was collection right or wrong, but how much? And I'll come back to it. And then there's the case where the police introduced some kind of a probe into the home to measure the temperature because they were suspecting that the person was growing marijuana. And in growing marijuana, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert at that, but it requires a certain level of heat. And so they wanted to see, it's a collection issue. The sniffing dogs, can you use a sniffing dog or not? These are all collection issues and no attention. And of course, cats, the expectation of privacy for Americans is a question of collection and not what is your expectation is going to happen to data after it's been collected. I mean, theoretically, you could have a split expectation, right? You could say it's fine for me to collect, but it's not fine for me to keep it. The court has, I'm unable to find a single case where the court says it's fine to collect, but not okay to keep. So then I started looking, where are some doctrine about secondary use? And again, I'm very happy to be corrected. I'm here to learn. But I could find so far basically two, again, overarching concepts. One is what the Americans called the third-party doctrine, and that is the notion that once you reveal something to another party, it's free game. The other party can give it to anybody else, and you give up your right by voluntarily surrendering. And the most often used example is when you tell the bank about your financial details, that's it. And I did a whole little article for University of Pennsylvania Law Review, called The Privacy Merchant, that has the result of private corporations. Okay, all American corporations collect information about their customers and profile them and keep track of them. But there are a growing number of corporations whose only business is trading information about people, and they keep dossiers about roughly 280 million Americans. You have to think about it for a moment. If the government would keep a dossier on 280 million Americans, libertarians and American civil libertarians, I don't know what they would do. Blow the White House up. I mean, it's just inconceivable. When a private corporation do it, that is private sector, it's fine. Now think about it, to complete this thought, I discovered that these private corporations have contact with the government, including the FBI and the CIA. So the difference is one click, that's all it is. Because if the dossiers are kept by a private company, and at night, it's maybe even during the day, its computer talks to the computer of the FBI. What's the difference if the FBI keeps the dossiers or it's kept in Akron, Ohio, and the FBI has to have one click and one check, and he gets information. But that's not the way the dialogue is in the law. The Fourth Amendment, all that stuff is strictly about limiting the government. The corporations, Americans don't have a right to privacy against the corporation. If the corporation announces a privacy policy, then you can go and sue it if it doesn't live up to its commitment. But if it doesn't announce it, you have no right to privacy against the corporation. But it's a completely obsolete idea, given the technical examples such as. So now, going then back to the third-party doctrine, if you really live by that, and the Americans do, in effect you have very little privacy left, because everything in the cloud is today, most of your communication, most personal information, and if the cloud is considered covered by the third-party doctrine, as it is, you in effect have no privacy left. So I thought that is not an acceptable. In terms of communitarian balance, it goes way too far in one direction. And then people told me there's this wonderful place called Europe, And there's, you know, I mean, and Israel, and all these enlightened people who, of course, would never do such a thing. And they have the Data Protection Directive or whatever it's called. And it takes the opposite position. The data is yours, either as your property or as a fundamental right. And any secondary use has to be approved by these benighted citizens. And so then I started giving talks in Europe on privacy. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, anybody in the room was ever asked to consent for secondary use of the information? And the amount of hands went up exactly like I saw here. None. And so they were kind of curious. I started asking the question, how come? So first of all, on reading the text a little more closely, even a non-lawyer discovered there are about 6 areas which are exempted. So to begin with, the law says, oh, for research you don't have to ask, and for public health you don't have to ask, and so on. So the list changes over the years, 95 recently, and so on. So. But basically, a very large area of exempted. And then second, they have something called a compliance gap, which is a polite way of saying they don't enforce the law. So you have, what you have here, on the one hand, a complete, well, almost complete end of privacy. On the other hand, a wonderful theory, which, by the way, if really implemented, would stop research and commerce and most police work. And if it's not implemented, we need some principles where to find the balance between the European ideal and the American reality. And so that's what I try to do, a Kleinigkeit. And so I suggested that we should combine, it's very important, combine 3 principles. And this is an extremely first approximation. And one of the many reasons I'm here and grateful for the discussion. I'm looking for people to join this project because it's way beyond what any one person can or should do. I developed this secondary use theory for the cyber age, and you can see it in some more of it in my paper. So this, I suggest that the criteria, you should use 3 criteria in order to decide what should or should not be governed by privacy. One criteria is the sensitivity of the information, and that not all information is equally sensitive. That information about which kind of yogurt you purchased should not be given the same protection as your HIV record, and that we can rank things crudely among those which are low to those which are high in sensitivity. And I pointed out the details in the paper to my, frankly, my delight, that in effect, though nobody talks about it that way, the courts and the legislator did good part of the work. There are already many things have been ranked, only they have not been ranked systematically. So Congress passed some law about protecting medical privacy, and then they passed some law protecting financial privacy. And for some odd historical reason, they passed a law protecting which video ways, but not what books you buy and such. But if you take all this back to back, you find a fairly decent ranking, and wouldn't take a lot to complete that ranking. I must digress here for 1 second. When I had the same conversation with my colleagues at our law school, they kept saying, there was some uneasiness in the room, and they kept saying, but what are you talking about, the legislator or the courts? And so they're talking about the Fourth Amendment or policy. And it took me a while to understand that I'm talking about the normative principles which drive both. That for me, the distinction, of course I can realize that the court work on very different principles than the legislator, who is governed by democratic rules rather than by interpretation of principles. But behind both are normative principles. And when the normative culture changes, both change. So our court used to say about segregation, black and white, it was legal, but it was also in the culture, in the society, and in Congress it was accepted. And then when we had the civil liberties, civil rights movement, the culture changed, and both sides changed. the court changed and Congress changed. We have now a debate about gay marriages, and the court changes, Congress changed, even the President of the United States changed. So there are normative principles which I'm talking about which affect both circulation. So sensitivity should be one of those principles which should affect both legislation and court cases. A very important detail is that the law would have to determine that it's illegal to use insensitive information to divine sensitive information. It's illegal to use insensitive information to divine sensitive information because giving big data, it's not difficult if I know a lot of insensitive information about you to figure out the sensitive information. And to give you an example of the employers, one of the violations of privacy, which are very common, that the Human Resource Department has medical records of people, and there comes a question of promotion, and the supervisor goes and looks at the medical records to see if that person, there's one consideration in promotion, and there's supposed to be a firewall, and so the question again here is, even if I cannot look at the medical records, but I can divine from other information. So the violation of the wall of fire should be treated the same way, whether you got the information by violating the prohibition on looking at medical records, or you got it from a study of the fact that, I bought a wig and I didn't show up for work at the beginning of each month and things like this. So that is one criteria, the sensitivity of the information. And the second, building on Jones but very beyond, is the amount of information I collect. And the amount of information has two dimensions. One is simply how many units do I have a surveillance on you for 1 hour or for a year. And second, what I call the bandwidth. And that is how many kinds of information I collect about you. I mean, do I collect information about your emotions or even your thoughts, or do I collect information only about the temperature in the kitchen? I digress here for 1 second about a very important issue for another day. It deserves a whole other discussion. Is this question about the home against the public space, which in my judgment is an increasingly obsolete distinction. And here the work can illustrate it with bandwidth. If I have a tool, as the court discussed, and I find out what is the temperature in the kitchen, but not more, from my viewpoint, it's a very narrow bandwidth. Right? I don't discover a lot about you if I know what temperature you keep in your kitchen, even your bedroom. I mean, it tells me something, but not a lot. That's in your home. On the other hand, if you're in a public park and you have a political discussion with somebody, and I have one of those long mics, and I listen to you from, as a police from 100 meters away, what you discuss in public, I would think it's a much greater violation of your privacy than I did because that information, A, is more sensitive, but B, has a much broader bandwidth. I find out much more about you. So the issue is not public-private, but how much information in terms of quantity and in terms of how much it reveals about you in terms of the kind of information I collect. Now, we could spend a whole week or months discussing how you measure volume and how you measure bandwidth. This is strictly a first approximation. The third variable, I decided I had to give a little name, and I call it Supination. You can live many happy years without that term, which I argue how much massaging you allow me to do. Do you allow me to collect it with many other kinds of information? You allow me to circulate it, and so on and so on. So if you combine these three variables, the sensitivity, volume, and amount of secondary analysis, you get a three-dimensional cube. And I found out that during this meeting Michael and I just attended that people who are not absolutely crazy about the paper love the chart. So those of you who don't have time to read a 54-page paper may want to jump to the chart You know, I wish I'm too old for PowerPoints, but I should have projected that lovely table. When you obviously, if you 3 dimensions, you cannot do a mosaic. You have to have a cube, right? And so, can I hold it up? Anybody?
I'm not sure it's
Okay,
in the
but-
paper itself.
Yeah, it's not.
It's not in this paper.
It's on the other one. Anyhow, all right. I mean, it's not difficult for you to imagine a chart. And so, once we did that, we start ranking the various existing laws, and it turns out that some of them fit very nicely, and some of them need to be adapted in order to implement this very first approximation of an attempt to provide a privacy theory which focuses on secondary use and is suitable for the cyber age. If that is not enough to provoke a discussion, I tell you what happened at the Herzliya conference.
Okay, questions, please. Discussion. Yeah, please.
I think whenever you have such difficult problems, it shows that your theory is not very good. And in the case of privacy, if you take the conservative attitude in the United States, which cherishes privacy very much, they are for economic theory that goes the other way, namely total free competition, which means all information, market information available, and it's easy to see that that means not only prices, but if you come to stocks and bonds, also to the viability of companies and so on, which is highly private. So there are no clear borderlines. So it is clear that the opinion held by most public speakers on this matter is inconsistent.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. No, I really don't have much to add. I have very much to give you.
Niv, could you please present yourself?
I'm Professor Niv Achitur.
Management.
Retiree of Tel Aviv University. I like very much your 3 criteria, the sensitivity, the amount, and the amount of secondary analysis. I'd like to suggest to add another criteria or have it kind of prerequisite to the sensitivity. And the criteria is the distinction between factual data and evaluative data. Now, factual data can be very sensitive, like medical records. But still, these are facts. And if we decide that the facts are open or at least partly open to the public, then we really don't care what will be their secondary analysis. Now, just a few examples, like name, address, education, marital status, things like that. These are facts. Why should we cover them or hide them? There's nothing. And if you're kind of running for presidency in Israel, you should also disclose your financial status.
And other stuff.
You don't have to.
How much is in your kasefet?
Now, evaluative data, from its very beginning, it's more sensitive. Like if my teacher, when I was in grade 4, told me that I have no future, except for, I don't know, garbage collection, then this is very sensitive. It was written in the record. I mean, that's a fiction story. It was written in the report at the end of the year, and this was grade 4, and it escorts me, it could escort me, all the way until getting a PhD or something. So I would say, before you say you divide it into sensitive and less sensitive, first divide it into factual and non-factual. evaluative. Evaluative is always suspected to be more sensitive. The factual, you can define it more objectively.
It's a very interesting idea. And again, I had now all of 30 seconds to think about it, so
Yeah.
I'd like to think about some more. But help me for a moment. So if you have cancer, is that a fact or is it evaluative?
No, this is a fact, but this
Okay.
can be more sensitive.
Okay, so...
I mean, there is a gray area, but once you put it in one of these two pockets, it's easy to measure.
Yeah, no, I need to think about it. It's just my preliminary worry is that there are some facts you may not, but yeah, I think that
But evaluation, I guess you will always not like to be disclosed.
That's kind of interesting because one of the things happened is until I don't remember exactly the year, at a certain point when professors evaluated their students or each other when they were up for tenure, that was considered highly confidential.
Mm-hmm.
And then the New York Times published on the front page in their evaluation of one of my colleagues, Robert Bella, there's another colleague wrote about him that he was one of the two best professors of comparative sociology. Listen carefully about that. He said he was the best out of two. If you take a larger group, and as a result, now because so often it's assumed that these evaluations become public, they become useless. They become almost useless. They're so bland because so here you can see the devastating effect on which is an important process. I mean, we need to be able to write recommendation letters which have some merit if you have to either engage in the most, indirect and such. Since medical records have become accessible to the patients, my wife was a physician, doesn't write anymore. He's an alcoholic. She writes he's fond of wine. So, and again, if you can read the code word, it's fine. If otherwise, or when he's obese, he's well-rounded. And so we need to find better ways of protecting evaluation, maybe to some extent too.
But if I may chip in, the sensitive, you gave the yogurt example, and I thought, the fact that I buy a yogurt can teach quite a lot about me. For example, whether I eat kosher or not, whether it's gluten-free or not, so it can imply my medical situation. If it's a very fancy kind of yogurt, it might say something about my financial status, and especially if you accumulate that data over time and see whether this was a one-time yogurt or this is the kind of yogurt that I eat over time. This innocent, insensitive data can easily become sensitive in the sense that it can, one can infer from it quite a few things about my health, religion, financial status, and maybe some other things.
It's a very fair challenge. So the question is where you go from here, then what's the next step? So if you say, therefore, all information should be treated the same way, you're back to the European ideal, and the game is over. Because then a very large part of commerce will have to stop. I mean, Google have to. I know it doesn't bother you. I'm just. I just like you to know about the others. So.
They have to close Twitter as well.
And much of research will have to stop. And for instance, the Mayo Clinic at one point tried to deal with that by trying to go back to every patient and get the consent to use information. And they spend 120% of their budget on just getting consent, and in effect they couldn't find many of the people, some were dead and such, and the research stopped. So first of all, it has enormous consequence for the common good. Second, politically, at least in the United States, it's inconceivable, because the private sector, such a hurt to their business, that I cannot see any possibility. To begin with, as I mentioned, the private sector is considered sacred and only government violations are concerned. But that one would really it would be almost a nuclear option. Finally, but that's, I think, gets us closer to a thing that's not just practical, but which I think is a principle here. You don't get that picture unless you do combine it with other pieces of information. So it's not the sensitivity is the issue, but the massaging. So if you abide by my law that you bought yogurt, but I don't know I don't collect it with information about all the other things you bought, and don't derive from them about your religious preference, because that would be sensitive. If I pass that law, then it's not a perfect world, but it gets closer to a protected world.
I would like to maybe to add something to that.
Eran Toch from the Faculty of Engineering at the university.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Many of these, new privacy challenges arise from what is known today as data mining, where lots of data is getting accumulated, and more importantly, as Niv said, it's your own data is being compared to the data of lots of other people. So if lots of other people buy certain yogurt and they're considered rich, then you're considered rich. Or if we look at a more interesting example, for many people today, it's not important if you have cancer or not, but if you have certain genetic information, then we can derive from that you will have cancer, or you will have high probability of having cancer in the future. This idea of the way you evaluate or the way you combine data could be used to kind of infer how much sensitivity does a set of data points have, or the potential for sensitivity.
Well, the Lord was merciful, and He protected us from Google by making the correlation less strong than some people assume. It gives you probabilities, but I may know, go back to your yogurt example, there's some poor people who use their food stamps to buy fancy yogurt, and there's some rich people who will not go near a yogurt. So anybody who again, we're not talking about single item of information. Once you start combining all the data and divine the different ballpark. But genetic, sometimes genes are determinative. Often there's this predisposition, they affect probabilities, but then I don't know what to do with that, because there is an issue here, but if you take into account again the limit of compiling data and massaging it, that's I think where the issue lies, and not in preventing me. If I'm a marketing company and I want to send you advertising, and I want to know, should I send you advertising about yogurt or not? Yeah. And all I need to know, are you buying yogurt or not, and which kind? Theoretically, and if you are a purist, you may want to stop that too. I argue that if you go that far, you don't get anything. So for political and practical and privacy purposes, I'll let you keep it track as a commercial company, even as a cloud, what kind of yogurt you buy, how often, and so on and so on. But I will not let you, and I even let you combine with what kind of bread you bought, But I will not let you do this to find out about medical. And if you do, I'll treat you the same way. So I think it's a reasonable way to proceed if we want to have anything to do with reality. And I'm sorry to come back to the example, but I found it very telling. Go look at Europe, and you see what happens. I don't know what happens in Israel. I'll have to learn. But you can come up with these ideals, and then nothing happens. By the way, to be honest with you, I find that something even more uncomfortable, because we have laws you disregard, They, first of all, violate the whole legitimacy of the legal system. Second, they become suddenly, some bully comes, everybody violates him, suddenly they go after somebody, catch him, and throw him to jail, and it become unfair. So I'd rather have a law which is a little closer to reality.
I have a long list of people who want to ask, so if you do want to ask a question, signal it to me in some way so so I can take note. Dr. Nicholas John, Media Studies, Hebrew University.
Can't do communication, but close enough. Thank you very much indeed for making the time for us. In the spirit of a preliminary exploration, I'd like to challenge the distinction between collection and secondary use. For instance, in a couple of ways. For instance, if I have an amnesiac stalker, I still won't like it. I will still consider that a violation of my privacy. It's important that he's an amnesiac. He sees me, but he forgets everything I've done, but he's still following me. I would feel.
Would he remember to follow you?
Yes.
Let's say it on his arm or something.
My point being that there's something about being watched that is discomforting, even if he's forgetting it straight away. So there's a chilling effect in the collection of data, even if that data isn't used, and especially if I don't know what that data is used for, and even if I think I know today what the data will be used for, then I won't necessarily know tomorrow. And I don't think that's just an empirical problem. I mean, I think that's a problem in principle, that we can't necessarily imagine the ways in which the data we create today will be used tomorrow. So that's one way I'd like to challenge the distinction between collection and secondary use. The other way is that if we take, say, a platform such as Facebook or social media, as socio-technical systems, the way they're constructed makes it impossible to analytically distinguish collection and use, right? The way that Facebook, for instance, nudges us to give a little bit more information. So nowadays, because some of my friends went to a girls' school in Manchester, Facebook's asking me, did you go to Cheadle Hulme School for Girls? So there's kind of nudging here, and this is the way the whole social media ecosystem works. So here, we know why they want to collect the data, and the way they're collecting it is related to the use they're going to do with it. So you can't analytically distinguish between the collection and the secondary use. I'm throwing that out there as a provocation.
No, not provocation at all. That's what I came here for dialogue and see if I can protect this very preliminary design. So, first of all, I'm not arguing that collection has no effect. So the fact that you show that collection has an effect, I completely agree with you. Actually, one of the interesting examples that comes up is in the debate whether the computers violate your privacy. Because from my viewpoint, the computers do not violate your privacy. So data which is collected and stays in the computers, this is similar to your forgetful stalker, right? It's there, but unless a human agent entered it, no violation of privacy occurred by some of us. Some of us violently disagree with that. Anyhow, so I'm not arguing, and it could have nevertheless a chilling effect. So I have no problem at all with the comment that collection has an effect. But the question stands for me, does it make a difference if for a moment we could prove, now if you cannot, that this was collected and then erased, or it was collected and kept forever and dossiered and so on and so on. Means it does make no difference holding collection stable, that variable stable, if it has a short life, like the CTV in immediately erased. It has a chilling effect on you when you enter the bank and it says, Big Brother is watching you, but let's assume for a moment that it is proven that it has no, it immediately disappears after you leave the bank, or it goes into this cloud with everything else about you. And I think it's fair to say that you can hold constant the effect of collection and see additional effect of secondary use, even the way about chilling. Now, the question, and that gives me an opportunity to add one more detail, because we're soon going to run out of time, and it's a very important detail, so special thanks to your intervention, is I discovered, and that was one of, when you do this work, occasionally you come across something in your own thinking which gives you a moment of kind of delight, kind of like discover something in the lab. So I discovered that accountability is negative supination. And let me explain that for a moment. So one thing I haven't discussed, that in fact there's a fourth dimension. Some people want me to create a four-dimensional space, and that made me terribly nervous. I don't begin to know how to draw a four-dimensional space. So I collapsed number 4 and 3. And that is the question, if somebody tells you that the information let me be concrete. The National Security Agency says it collects information about people's phone calls, not the calls, but the medical records, but they are in a computer, and they sit there in case it needs it after a terrorist attack, so it will not have to go to all the different phone companies and start collecting information. But it needs an order of a judge in order to look at any particular record. Okay? Assuming for a moment, this is the issue here is, can I trust the NSA that it will live up to that commitment? And so we have a whole set of accountability mechanisms whose purpose to reassure the citizens that indeed that law is observed, including civilian observers, not just government agents you may not trust. So it turns out that the more accountable a system, the more comfortable you would feel that the secondary use are limited. But each mechanism of accountability, and that was my little insight, means less subordination, means less allowing. That's what they say. You cannot do it without a judge order, means there's certain massaging you cannot do. So therefore, if subordination is really whatever massaging is possible, minus accountability. So that goes back to your issue, and you said it's a question, you use the word, if I can trust, the secondary use should be limited. If I cannot trust the limit on secondary use, then I agree with you. The difference will largely disappear. But that, again, with enormous consequences for everything we do, and therefore, I'm surely cannot come up with a perfect accountability system, but I think the whole realistic struggle is between better and less strong accountability system. And let me, we may have to close soon, tell a little anecdote here to illustrate that point. It's not an anecdote, it's a true story. During the Bush administration, the government claimed that there were 400 terrorist acts which were solved due to the Patriot Act as proof that it was a useful tool. And the Washington Post got hold of the list. And they showed that, first of all, of the 400 cases, 200 cases had nothing to do with terrorism. Of the other 200, 180 were completely minor cases. So just to illustrate what minor was, there was an 18-year-old girl who sent a fax to a captain of a cruise ship and says, I miss my boyfriend. If you don't bring the cruise ship immediately back to harbor, I'm going to blow it up. So, and that was listed as a threat to mass transit. And so after people read this report, they felt, that Patriot Act was not justified. But imagine if if the Washington Post would report the opposite, that indeed 180 major terrorist attack on New York subways, et cetera, were stopped, you would take a different position. So the accountability and the amount of reliability of the institution of trust becomes a variable in that question of the distinction between collection and secondary use.
I suggest that we collect a few questions and then wrap up.
You're the boss.
Yeah, Alon Peled, Political Science, Hebrew University.
Thank you, Professor Etzioni. It was an excellent talk.
Thank you.
I want to continue from where Nick and Elan stopped. If I were a chief technology officer of Axiom or any corporation or the NSA, I absolutely will have no problem with the first and second criteria, not with the sensitivity and not with the amount. I will know how to overcome them. So I want to continue what my colleagues here started with the third criteria. I absolutely could not live with the third criteria because even by the ability to combine the data, the whole essence of big data and data mining and business intelligence is combining and recombining data, creating new data, then combining with primordial data. And so basically the only example you gave was basically you're allowing a corporation to combine information about the milk that they sell and the bread that they sell, and not allowing them to buy data from any other source and combine it with their own data. That's the equivalent of returning this entire corporate and government world to the Stone Age. And so short of returning to the Stone Age, could you offer some useful guidelines with regard to your third criteria and offer what is reasonable for me as a corporate officer or as a government officer to buy as a third-party data and combine with existing data, other than saying absolutely you cannot buy any of this data?
Thank you. Dr. Tali Chatuka from the Geography Studies and urban lab, right?
Human.
Something. Well, I'm
Here
an
the
architect
university.
and a planner, so I have two broader questions taking you a little bit to maybe a sociological perspective. First, I would like not to talk specifically on the criteria, but who is responsible or who should push this agenda forward? What's the role of the public? Are they at all relevant? It seems to me that there is a lot of they're somehow passive, indifferent, maybe docile bodies, as Foucault was calling us like back in the 70s. The second question, which I'm worried about, is of course the distinction between private and public, and you talked a little bit about this, but maybe we don't have public space anymore. Maybe it's all one big private space with different layers of data collections. I mean, maybe we have to forget it all about public. I mean, I think that what we are sensing now is a new paradigm about what it means, not just what privacy means, but also what public means. So these are a little bit out of the context of the specific paper, but...
And there was another question here, I'm not sure, Nir, or... We have limited time, so I'd like to allow those who haven't yet asked, okay? So, Nir, Sunny, no? There was a finger here beforehand. Okay. Lior, Cyber Studies Center here at the university.
Yes, I think that the criteria you proposed are kind of something you can work with, and even more, I think they can be translated into machine language. And
Wow.
yeah, I hope so, and we can work with it. But, from my point of view as a political scientist, who would be the one in charge of validating this criteria and saying this is what we do, especially given the American distrust in the federal government as the major threat. I mean, what would be preferable, to privatize this thing to some sort of non-profit organization, or to go with it through the political system, the parliament and everything? Decision.
Closing comments. Replies on closing comments.
Okay. So I very much agree with you. If you take it as a dichotomy, the third variables, either yes or no, then everything you say is correct. And actually, it's interesting because, again, the courts very much talk in dichotomies. Variables are social science language, not, I find not, though with the exception of Jones, But examination is very much a question as a variable. So it's, look, I had a total of 40 minutes. I use a shorthand. Yes, I can allow them much more, but then the question is, spelling out what. So I would allow them to combine bread, yogurt, and letters, and historical data. For instance, I would allow them to, as they do, take everything which is already public. So divorce records, real estate records, everything which is already public. I don't accept this idea that, if you want, you can legislate against some specific things if they're sensitive. But the notion that if I made something public, but now it's become more public, I'll suddenly, anyhow, so it's a variable and depends how far you want to go. About the distinction between private and public, I very much agree that it's eroding, both practically and conceptually, but I think in the other direction. Everything is becoming public. And so even a more interesting question is...
public in the sense of exposed, or
yeah.
Public in the sense, so we are constantly exposed all the time. There is no private space.
There's less. I don't think we should be completely, give up on it, but more things are public than they used to be. In part for what we just talked about, because of the internet. So it used to be, if you wanted to know if somebody had arrested, you had to go to all the police stations in the world and read all their paper ledgers, which obviously was absurd. And recently the Malaysian airplane crashed. They looked through 40 million passports in 0.2 seconds. So it shows you how much more public our life become. About accountability, again, it would take me at least an hour to justice to your question. But there are layers of accountability in place which are not trivial but not satisfactory. I want to make it clear. Both. They're not trivial. Inspector generals, for instance, congressional hearings and such. But I think they're not sufficient. And I suggested creating an additional civilian layer which is similar to police review boards in cities. For instance, if you think about the 9/11 Commission, which was bipartisan, had people very respected by everybody, had clearance, they came out with certain recommendations. And that's not, we're not coming to a perfect world, but a more accountable world. I don't want to go summarize what I said. I appreciate your endless patience. We have, again, this wonderful world of email, so I'm hoping you all email me more, not questions, corrections, new theories. This is a collective communitarian enterprise, so please join the communitarian enterprise. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much.